History is a graveyard of empires. Look upon the ruins of Rome, the sands that cover the pharaohs of Egypt, the shattered columns of the Persian kings. Every worldly kingdom, no matter how powerful, eventually succumbs to the dust of history. All except one. There is an institution, an empire of the spirit that has outlasted them all. It was founded 2,000 years ago by a penniless carpenter from a forgotten corner of the Roman Empire. It has faced every imaginable threat: persecution, corruption, schism, and revolution, and yet it endures. This is the story of the greatest survivor in human history, the Catholic Church. And the reason for its miraculous endurance is the most profound truth of all. Chapter 1. The Divine Promise of Indefectibility. Before we can test the Church against the crucible of history, we must first understand the divine promise upon which its entire claim rests. The Catholic Church does not claim to have survived for 2 millennia because of the political skill of its popes or the cleverness of its theologians. It claims to have survived because its founder, Jesus Christ, made an explicit and unbreakable promise. This promise is recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, after Simon makes his great confession of faith, declaring that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus gives him a new name and a divine commission. He says, "And I tell you, you are Peter," which means rock, "and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." This is the divine charter of the Church. The gates of hell is a powerful biblical metaphor for all the powers of death, chaos, and destruction. Jesus is making a solemn divine promise that his church, built on the rock of Peter's faith and office, will be indefectible. This means it will endure, without changing its essential nature or its core teachings, until the end of time. He concludes the Gospel of Matthew with a second promise, an assurance of his own abiding presence. "And behold, I am with you always, to the end of the age." The entire 2,000-year history of the Catholic Church is the story of these two promises being put to the ultimate test, time and time again. Chapter 2. The first test. The might of Rome. The first great test began almost immediately. The fledgling Christian Church was born into the heart of the most powerful and ruthless empire the world had ever known, the Roman Empire. As we have explored before, the Roman state saw the new Christian faith not as a harmless private belief, but as a direct threat to its own stability. The Christians were called atheists because they refused to worship the Roman gods and break the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. Their refusal to burn a pinch of incense to the divine emperor was seen as an act of treason. For nearly 300 years, the Roman state, with its iron legions, its sophisticated legal system, and its absolute power, attempted to exterminate this new faith. The persecutions came in waves. It began with the sadistic cruelty of Emperor Nero in 64 AD, who used Christians as scapegoats for the Great Fire of Rome, famously using their burning bodies as torches to light his gardens. It continued under emperors like Domitian, who insisted on being addressed as Lord and God. In the 3rd century, the persecutions became more systematic and empire-wide. Emperor Decius in 250 AD issued an edict requiring all citizens to perform a public sacrifice to the Roman gods. Those who refused were to be executed. This was a direct attempt to force Christians to choose between their faith and their life. But the most terrible trial was yet to come. The Great Persecution under Emperor Diocletian, beginning in 303 AD, was the most systematic and brutal attempt to wipe Christianity from the face of the earth. Churches were destroyed, scriptures were burned, clergy were arrested and tortured, and countless lay faithful were subjected to the most horrific deaths imaginable. By all the laws of history, the Church should have been annihilated. It had no army, no political power, and no earthly defense. It was a flock of sheep in the midst of a pack of wolves. Chapter 3. The unthinkable reversal. What happened next is one of the most shocking turnarounds in human history. The Roman Empire, which had tried for 3 centuries to destroy the Church, failed. The blood of the martyrs, as the Church Father Tertullian famously wrote, became the seed of the Church. The courage and the charity of the persecuted Christians won the hearts of the pagan world. The empire that could not crush the church was instead conquered by it. The great turning point came with the Emperor Constantine. In 312 AD, on the eve of a decisive battle, tradition holds that he had a vision of a Christian symbol in the sky with the words, "In this sign you will conquer." After his victory, Constantine effectively legalized Christianity with the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, ending the age of persecutions. Within a single lifetime, the church had gone from a hunted, illegal sect to a favored and protected religion. By the end of the 4th century, under Emperor Theodosius, Christianity had become the official state religion of the Roman Empire. This was the first great historical proof of Christ's promise. The church had faced the gates of hell in the form of the Roman state, and the gates of hell had not prevailed. But no sooner had the church converted its greatest persecutor than it faced a new and perhaps even greater existential threat. Chapter 4. The second test, the collapse of civilization. Having become the official religion of the Roman Empire, the church's destiny was now deeply intertwined with the fate of Rome itself. Its diocesan structure was based on Roman administrative districts. Its language was Latin. Its great centers of learning and authority were in the great cities of the empire. But the empire was rotting from within, beset by internal corruption, economic collapse, and relentless pressure from barbarian tribes on its borders. The Western Roman Empire began to crumble. In the year 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. The city of Rome, the eternal city that had been the master of the world for a millennium, was sacked by the Visigoths under Alaric. The shock and trauma of this event were profound. Pagans blamed the disaster on the Christians, claiming the old gods were punishing Rome for abandoning them. Even many Christians were thrown into a crisis of faith. Their world was collapsing. The final collapse of the Western Roman Empire came in 476 AD. What followed was a century of chaos, violence, and societal breakdown. The great Roman infrastructure, its roads, its aqueducts, its legal system fell into ruin. Trade ceased. Cities emptied. Waves of barbarian tribes, Visigoths, Vandals, Franks, Lombards, swept across Europe, carving out their own petty kingdoms. This was the end of the ancient world. The Church, which had just recently tied its fortunes to the Roman order, should have collapsed along with it. It should have been swept away in the tide of chaos, a forgotten historical relic of a dead empire. But it was not. The Church not only survived the death of its host civilization, it became the instrument of salvation for the next. But how could this fragile institution possibly survive the long dark night of a collapsed civilization? A period of chaos and ignorance that would last for centuries. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century plunged Europe into a period of chaos and fragmentation. The great institutions of law, learning, and civil order that had defined the ancient world vanished. This was the ultimate external threat. The very civilization that had become the vessel for the Church had died. By all historical logic, the Church should have died with it, a forgotten religion of a fallen empire. But it was in this dark night of civilization that the Church revealed its most remarkable and divinely inspired capacity for preservation and renewal. Chapter 5. The Monks Who Saved Civilization. The answer to how the Church survived the Dark Ages is found in countless remote and quiet valleys, on windswept islands, and in secluded forests all across Europe. The answer is the monasteries. While the secular world was consumed by warfare and ignorance, the Benedictine monasteries, following the wise and balanced rule of Saint Benedict of Nursia, became small, self-sufficient islands of peace, prayer, and most critically of learning. The primary work of the monk was the Opus Dei, the work of God, the daily cycle of liturgical prayer. But a second sacred duty was the preservation of knowledge. In rooms called scriptoriums, generations of monks dedicated their lives to the painstaking hand-copying of ancient texts. Their first priority, of course, was the sacred scriptures. It is almost impossible to overstate the debt that Christianity owes to these anonymous scribes. Without their labor, the Bible would not have survived the collapse of civilization. But their work did not stop there. They also copied and preserved the great philosophical works of Plato and Aristotle, the poetry of Virgil, and the histories of Livy and Tacitus. In an age of widespread illiteracy, the monasteries became the sole guardians of the intellectual patrimony of the entire Western world. They were the bridge that carried the light of faith and reason across the dark chasm of a fallen civilization. Furthermore, it was these same monks who became the great evangelists to the barbarian tribes who had conquered the old empire. Men like St. Augustine of Canterbury, sent by Pope Gregory the Great, brought the faith to the Anglo-Saxons in England. St. Patrick brought it to Ireland. St. Boniface, the apostle to the Germans, brought it to the Germanic tribes. Slowly, patiently, and over centuries, the Church, through her monks, converted and civilized the very peoples who had destroyed her former world, laying the foundation for a new united Christian civilization, Christendom. Chapter 6, The Internal Threat, Heresy and Schism. Even as the Church was fighting for survival against external chaos, it faced an arguably greater threat from within, the threat of doctrinal collapse and permanent division. As we have explored before, the Arian crisis of the 4th century nearly destroyed the Church from its core, denying the very divinity of its founder. For decades, a majority of the bishops in the East were Arians. The Church should have, by all accounts, dissolved into a dozen competing Christianities with different beliefs about Christ. The fact that it did not, the fact that the Orthodox Nicene faith was ultimately victorious, is a testament to the divine guidance promised by Christ, a guidance exercised through the authority of the ecumenical councils and the steadfastness of the papacy. But the Church would face another great test of its unity. For 1,000 years, the Church had remained essentially one, united in a communion of 5 great patriarchates: Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. But theological, political, and cultural differences, especially between the Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East, had been growing for centuries. This long and complex estrangement culminated in the Great Schism of 1054. The Pope in Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople excommunicated each other, leading to a formal and tragic split between what would become the Catholic Church in the West and the Orthodox churches in the East. This was a catastrophic wound to the body of Christ. The Church had lost its 4 other ancient patriarchates. From a human perspective, this should have been a fatal blow, reducing the Western Church to a merely local or regional sect. And yet, centered on the rock of the Petrine ministry, the Catholic Church not only endured, but entered one of its most dynamic periods of theological and cultural flourishing in the High Middle Ages. Chapter 7. The Nadir, Corruption in the Papacy. Perhaps the most compelling proof of the Church's divine nature is that it has survived not only its external enemies, but its own internal, sinful leaders. The promise of Christ that the gates of hell would not prevail against the Church was a promise to protect the institution and its teaching. It was not a promise that every pope, bishop, or priest would be a saint. The history of the papacy, in particular, has seen periods of profound and scandalous moral corruption. The 10th century is known by historians as the Saculum Obscurum, the Dark Century. The papacy fell under the control of powerful and corrupt Roman aristocratic families. Popes were installed and deposed through bribery, conspiracy, and violence. The period was so infamous, it became known as the pornocracy. Later, during the Renaissance, the papacy was again afflicted by worldliness. Popes acted more like Italian princes than spiritual fathers, engaging in warfare, nepotism, and extravagant luxury. The pontificate of Pope Alexander VI, of the infamous Borgia family, was marked by profound personal immorality. Here lies the miracle. Any merely human institution, a corporation, a kingdom, a political party, would have imploded under such corrupt leadership. Its credibility would have been shattered, its mission abandoned. And yet through all of this, the Church endured. Not a single doctrine of the faith was ever officially corrupted by these sinful popes. The deposit of faith was passed on intact. The sacraments were still validly celebrated. The line of apostolic succession, the office of Peter, continued. The survival of the Church through the sins of its own leaders is a stark and powerful testament that its foundation is not human, but divine. Chapter 8. The Great Division, the Protestant Reformation. After surviving the fall of an empire, centuries of heresy, and profound internal corruption, the Church faced what was arguably its greatest crisis since the Arian heresy. the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. Fueled by a combination of legitimate grievances against corruption and radical new theological ideas, the Reformation tore the unity of Western Christendom apart. This was not a schism in a distant land. This was a civil war in the heart of the Church. Entire nations, England, Scotland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and large parts of Germany and Switzerland, were lost to the Catholic faith. Churches were seized, monasteries were destroyed, and thousands of priests, religious and lay faithful were martyred. The Church lost half of its children, immense wealth, and the political unity of Europe was shattered forever. From a purely historical and sociological perspective, the Catholic Church should have collapsed. It should have been reduced to a minor sect in southern Europe, a relic of a bygone age, but the gates of hell did not prevail. In response to this crisis, the Church convened the Great Council of Trent. This council reaffirmed and clarified Catholic doctrine, corrected many of the abuses that had fueled the Reformation, and launched a period of profound internal reform known as the Counter-Reformation. This period saw a massive explosion of new spiritual energy, the founding of new religious orders like the Jesuits, and the launch of the greatest missionary effort in human history. As the Church carried the faith to the New World, to Africa, and to the Far East, the institution that should have died instead found new and unexpected life. By surviving the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church demonstrated a resilience that defied all earthly explanation. It weathered the loss of half of its territory, reformed itself from within, and found new life in a global missionary expansion. It had faced down Roman emperors, barbarian warlords, heretical bishops, corrupt popes, and revolutionary reformers. But as the age of faith gave way to the age of reason, a new and more radical set of enemies was gathering on the horizon. These new threats would not seek to reform the Church or to offer a rival version of Christianity. They would seek to destroy the very idea of God itself, and they would do so with a revolutionary fervor and a murderous cruelty that the world had never before seen. The age of ideology was dawning. By surviving the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church demonstrated a resilience that defied all earthly explanation. It weathered the loss of half of its territory, reformed itself from within, and found new life in a global missionary expansion. It had faced down Roman emperors, barbarian warlords, heretical bishops, corrupt popes, and revolutionary reformers. But as the age of faith gave way to the age of reason, a new and more radical set of enemies was gathering on the horizon. These new threats would not seek to reform the Church or to offer a rival version of Christianity. They would seek to destroy the very idea of God itself, and they would do so with a revolutionary fervor and a murderous cruelty that the world had never before seen. The age of ideology was dawning. Chapter 9. The third test. The French Revolution. The first great modern war against the Church began in the heart of what was once called the eldest daughter of the Church, France. The French Revolution of 1789 did not just seek to overthrow a king, it sought to overthrow the King of Kings. Fueled by the anti-clerical and atheistic philosophies of the Enlightenment, the revolutionaries saw the Catholic Church as an integral part of the old regime that had to be utterly destroyed. What followed was the first systematic attempt to completely de-Christianize a nation. The state confiscated all church property. Monasteries and convents were suppressed, and their inhabitants were driven out. Priests and bishops were forced to swear an oath of allegiance to the new secular state, an oath that severed their communion with the Pope. Those who refused, the non-juring clergy, were hunted down as traitors. Thousands of priests, nuns, and lay faithful were martyred, either by the blade of the guillotine or in brutal mass drownings. The revolutionaries attempted to create a new, godless religion of the state. The ancient Christian calendar was abolished and replaced with a new revolutionary calendar. Churches were desecrated and turned into temples of reason. In the most infamous act of this period, a prostitute was enthroned on the high altar of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris and worshipped as the goddess of reason. This was the ultimate expression of the revolution's goal: to replace the worship of God with the worship of man. The persecution was brutal and absolute. The Church in France was shattered. From a purely political perspective, it should have been destroyed. But the promise of Christ held true. After a decade of terror, the revolution burned itself out. Napoleon, for pragmatic reasons, signed a concordat with the Pope in 1801, restoring the Church in France. The Church, though wounded and scarred, had survived its first encounter with a modern atheistic and totalitarian ideology. But it would not be the last. Chapter 10. The fourth test, the totalitarian century. The 20th century saw the rise of the most murderous and anti-Christian ideologies in human history. In the East, communism, following the officially atheistic philosophy of Karl Marx, who called religion the opiate of the masses, seized power in Russia in 1917. What followed was a systematic and unparalleled persecution of the Church. The Soviet Union and its satellite states in Eastern Europe waged a 70-year war against God. Churches were dynamited, seminaries were closed, clergy were executed or sent to the gulags. The practice of the faith was driven underground. Millions upon millions of Christians, Orthodox and Catholic, were martyred for their refusal to renounce Christ. In the West, another neo-pagan ideology rose to power: Nazism. While not officially atheist, Nazism was profoundly anti-Christian. Hitler despised the weak and effeminate morality of the gospel, with its emphasis on mercy and love for the weak. He planned to eventually replace the Christian cross with the swastika and the Bible with Mein Kampf. The Nazi regime persecuted the Church, arresting and executing thousands of priests, religious, and lay leaders who had the courage to speak out against its evil. Saints like Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, Edith Stein, and Maximilian Kolbe were martyred in the death camps of Auschwitz. The Church in Germany and Poland was under constant and brutal assault. By the middle of the 20th century, the Catholic Church was being simultaneously persecuted by the totalitarian regimes of both the far left and the far right. She was being crushed between the two great ideological millstones of the modern age. By all human logic, she should have been annihilated, and yet she survived. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union, the great godless empire that had martyred millions, collapsed under the weight of its own economic and moral bankruptcy, a collapse that many, including Pope St. John Paul II, attributed to the spiritual intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary. The Nazi regime, the Thousand-Year Reich, lasted only 12 years before being defeated and consigned to the ash heap of history. Once again, the gates of hell had not prevailed. Chapter 11, the final test, the velvet persecution of secularism. After surviving the iron fist of violent persecution for most of its history, the Church in the 21st century now faces what is perhaps its most subtle and therefore most dangerous threat: the velvet persecution of modern Western secularism. This is not a persecution of the sword, but of the mind and the heart. It does not seek to martyr the body, but to suffocate the soul. This new ideology has several components. First, relativism, the belief that there is no objective truth, especially in matters of morality and religion. You have your truth and I have my truth. In such a world, the Church's claim to be the guardian of the one true faith revealed by God is seen as the ultimate form of arrogance and intolerance. Second, materialism and consumerism. This is the practical belief that this life is all there is, and that the purpose of human existence is to accumulate wealth, possessions, and sensory pleasure. This creates a culture of distraction, a spiritual anesthesia that numbs the soul's natural longing for God and for eternity. Third, a radical new sexual anthropology, which rejects the biblical and natural law understanding of marriage, family, and even the biological reality of male and female. In this new moral universe, the Church's timeless teachings on the sanctity of life, the nature of marriage, and sexual morality are no longer just seen as old-fashioned. They are increasingly portrayed as a form of bigotry and hatred. Pope Benedict XVI called this new cultural reality the dictatorship of relativism. It is a dictatorship because while it preaches tolerance, it has no tolerance for the Church's claim to objective truth. It seeks to push the faith out of the public square, out of our schools, our laws, our businesses, and to confine it to the private sphere of personal opinion. This velvet persecution does not create martyrs of blood, but it seeks to create a generation of silent, comfortable, and compromised Christians who are too afraid or too distracted to live and proclaim the full truth of the gospel. This is the great test for the Church in our time, Final conclusion. We began with a mystery that defies all the laws of history, the improbable 2,000-year survival of the Catholic Church. Our journey took us through the annals of time, and we witnessed the Church confront a seemingly endless series of extinction-level events. She survived the brutal persecutions of the Roman Empire, an empire that crucified her founder. She survived the total collapse of that empire's civilization. She survived the internal rot of heresy, schism, and the profound corruption of her own leaders. She survived the shattering of Christendom in the Protestant Reformation. And she has survived the murderous atheistic ideologies of the 20th century. Empires have risen and fallen, philosophies have come and gone, but the Catholic Church, wounded and scarred, yet ever ancient and ever new, remains. No merely human institution could have survived this relentless, 2 millennia-long onslaught. Its survival is not a historical accident. It is a lasting, visible, and miraculous proof of the truth of the promise that its divine founder made to a humble fisherman on the shores of Galilee. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. The Catholic Church is not just another institution. It is a living body, and its soul is the Holy Spirit. Its miraculous endurance is the greatest historical sign of its divine origin, a sign for all the world to see that Jesus Christ is with his church, always, to the very end of the age.